We're going to be continuing on with our lesson through the book of Genesis. We're going to be talking about one of my personal favorite Old Testament characters. Surprise, surprise. It's Isaac. And so I'm with Augustine. No, it wasn't Augustine. It was Philo. Said that Isaac was the most honorable and noble, pure of all the patriarchs. And, who am I to, argue with Philo? So.
How do you spell that?
My Isaac or his Isaac or what? Isaac in Hebrew is actually Yitzchak. And so when I go to Chick-fil-A and they ask for a name on the order, I say Yitzchak. And no, true story. We did go there one time and I was ordering and Brittany was beside me and she said, "What's the name for the order?" And I said, "Brittany." And she looked at me and looked at Brittany and said, I said, her name is much easier to spell than mine. And she said, "Well, what's your name?" And I said, Yitzchak. And she goes, "How do you spell Brittany?" And so, but that's what we're going to be talking about tonight is in Genesis chapter 20 and Genesis 21. And so let's go ahead and let's read verses 1 through 7 of Genesis chapter 20 and talk about Abraham and Abimelech. Genesis 20 verses 1 through 7. From there they journeyed toward the territory of the Negeb and lived between Kadesh and Shur. And he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said to Sarah his wife, "She is my sister." And Abimelech king of Gerar said and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man, because the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife." Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, "Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did not he himself say to me, 'She is my sister'? And she herself said, 'He is my brother.' In the integrity of my heart and in this innocence of my hands, I have done this." Then God said to him in a dream, "Yes, I know that you have done this in integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not let you touch her. Now then, return to the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours." And so Abraham, once again, deceives a king about his relationship with his wife Sarah. And so where have we seen this happen before? In Egypt. That's exactly right. They go down to Egypt and he tells Sarah, "When we go here, we're going to tell everybody that you're my sister because you're beautiful, and I'm afraid that they're going to kill me when they see you." And here we realize that Sarah's 90 years old. And so they go down here to the land of the Philistines and he says, "No, we're going to do this again." We're going to find out in verse 13 in the next section we're about to read that Abraham just doesn't do this twice. He's going to tell Abimelech that this is what we do every place we go. And so for the last 30 years that Abraham has been traveling, every time they go to a new city or new place, he introduces Sarah not as his wife, but as his sister. And of course, he's going to explain to Abimelech that it's only kind of like a half lie. And so God goes to Abimelech in a dream and he tells him that he is going to be a dead man if he doesn't hand Sarah back over, which is interesting because it's, you're a dead man. Who knew that God was the one that coined that phrase? He tells Abimelech, "You're going to be a dead man if you don't give this woman whom you've taken back to her husband, because number one, she's married. Number two, that husband just so happens to be a prophet." And so for the first time in the Old Testament, we have a word that is used. Does anybody want to take a guess what that word is that we read in this section? It's the first time this office or this title, this word has been used in the Old Testament. Prophet, that's exactly right. This is the first time that prophet is ever used in the Old Testament, in the Bible itself. And so Abraham is a prophet. He is somebody who communicates with God. He's someone who can pray on behalf of someone, almost kind of like a priest, if you will. Now Melchizedek has already been called priest of God Most High, but nobody has been mentioned as a prophet. And so Abraham is actually the first person mentioned in the Bible as being someone who is a prophet. And so Abraham moves from Hebron. He's been at Hebron for quite some time now, and he travels about 35 miles south to Gerar. And we don't really know exactly where that is, but we know it's in between Kadesh and Shur. So we know the general area, but not the exact location of the city. And so God recognizes that Abraham is someone who can intercede on the behalf of Abimelech. And so Abimelech is upset. And so Abimelech confronts Abraham. So let's read verses 8 through 13 when Abimelech calls Abraham before him. So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all of his servants and told them all these things. And the men were very much afraid. And then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done." And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What did you see that you did this thing?" And Abraham said, "I did it because I thought, there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness that you must do to me. At every place which we come, say of me, he is my brother." And so we see here that this is a common thing that him and Sarah do every time they go to a new place. But one of the interesting things here is when he says, "You have caused a great sin." And so when he mentions a great sin, he's just not talking about this is a big sin. A great sin is actually a phrase that is used throughout the ancient Near East to refer to one particular sin. Does anybody want to take a wild guess what that is? What's that? Adultery. And so in the ancient Near East, a great sin, or the great sin, was considered to be adultery. It's called that in Egyptian marriage contracts. It's called that in Mesopotamian hymns to Nanarta and Shamash, the two the chief king and queen gods in their pantheon. And in Canaan, the king of the Ugarites extradites and executes his wife because she committed the great sin. And so adultery is commonly referred in the ancient Near East as the great sin and considered extremely detrimental to society, and to the extent that it is characteristic of anarchy and the society breaking down. Hittite laws, Middle Assyrian laws, and the Code of Hammurabi all contain legislation against adultery. And so one of the things that I find interesting is that we live in a society where no sin really is shameful, but even in the ancient world, 3,000 years ago, really 4,000 years ago, that adultery was recognized as the great sin in the ancient Near Eastern cultures. And so it's just interesting. So when you see that phrase, there's more to that than just Abimelech saying, "You shouldn't have done this to me. You lied against me." That's not what Abimelech's talking about. He says, "You almost caused me to commit adultery by not telling me this woman was your wife. And so how could you cause me to do this great sin, or allow me to do this great sin?" And so Abraham admits his fear, and then Abimelech himself gives a peace offering. And so let's read verses 14 through 18. And finish out the text. Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham, and returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, "Behold, my land is before you, dwell where it pleases you." To Sarah he said, "Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone that you are vindicated." Then Abraham had prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and his female slaves, so that they bore children. For the Lord had caused all the wounds of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah to be closed, Abraham's wife. And so Abimelech makes a peace offering, and he gives Abraham slaves, livestock, and 1,000 pieces or shekels of silver. And so he wants to show that he's innocent. And so he's giving this large, extravagant gift to Abraham as a sign that Sarah has not been violated in any such way. 1,000 pieces of shekels of silver weighed about 25 pounds, and would have been more money than an average laborer could make in their entire lifetime. And so, if the average American makes, $50,000 and he works 35 years, do the math. So modern day equivalent of well over $1 million. And so he gives this to her, and the text stresses the fact that Sarah was not touched. Why is this important? Yeah, because in chapter 19, right? She's been with Abraham for what? 50 years? More? We don't know. She's been with him at least 25. And they've never had a son. And then in chapter 19, she's told, you and Abraham are going to have a son. Then all of a sudden, she goes into a man's house who thinks that she's now his wife. Then you get to chapter 21, and guess what happens? She has a son named Isaac, right? And so the text stresses the point here that she was not touched, that God had caused Abimelech not to fulfill the role of a husband sexually, and by virtue had closed the wombs of the women in his house. And so it stresses the point here that Sarah's not touched, and that's why Abimelech gives such a large gift to show that Sarah has not been touched. It's stressing the point that she has not been violated in such way, and not to cause any doubts on who Isaac's father is in the next chapter. And so, what does Abraham do for Abimelech? He prays for him, right? And we see here that Abimelech didn't do anything wrong, right? He didn't, at least not knowingly, right? He didn't violate Sarah's marriage covenant with Abraham by sleeping with her or committing adultery. He did take her from Abraham, although he didn't realize that she was married. But it's not until what happens that he's made well again and everybody in his household. Until Abraham intercedes on his behalf, right? And so it's interesting because I think about Abraham being a prophet and an intercessor for Abimelech to make him well. And I can't help but think of Christ, who is our prophet, right? Deuteronomy 18, Moses said there's going to be a prophet and a lawgiver who's going to come after me who's better than me. He's talking about Jesus. So Jesus himself is a prophet. Hebrews 1-3 tells us that. It says, the past days God spoke to us, by angels and by, other ways, but now he's spoken to us through his son. Jesus, the prophet. But he's also the priest in Hebrews chapter 8 and 9. He's our high priest who makes intercession for us. And so just like Abraham was the prophet and the intercessor that made Abimelech whole, Christ is the prophet and intercessor that makes us whole. And so you kind of see a little bit of allegory, I guess you could see, between Abraham and Abimelech and Jesus and us. And so any questions or comments on chapter 20? I know you got them. Don't be shy.
It just seems strange that these people that have numerous wives can be so strict about adultery.
Yeah.
They can have a parallel.
Yeah. That's right. It's men miscarrying. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. It's true, though. I mean, it's true. I mean, and then and honestly, the idea, most men in the ancient world only had one wife. And so when we talk about men with multiple wives, we start talking about concubines. It's mostly just the rich who can be able to afford multiple grown adults, with what they have. And so it is interesting, right? For a king to have multiple wives was not a big deal, but for a woman to have multiple male partners was punishable by death. So it was a very different legal and societal code. Yes and no. Yes and no. Concubines were seen more as an official capacity. And so they were considered to be second sons. So when sometimes they'd be considered concubines and sometimes they'd be considered wives. And what happened was, in a lot of ancient cultures, and it wasn't just in the ancient Near East, but even like Chinese cultures, you had like the wife, even in Egyptian culture, right? Like Imhotep and stuff like that. Like you would have like the empress, like the one wife. And so like any sons that come from that wife is the legitimate son. Now, it doesn't matter. Maybe you've got a concubine and that son's 20, and when you die, your wife's son is 3. Don't matter. Like you're going to have somebody in charge until he's 15, until he can take over, because his mom was the wife, the empress, the one in charge. So it was sometimes they were considered to be wives, but almost like second wives, and so not as high on the standard. So
seems like Abraham and Sarah were even worse than brother and sister right there.
Well, it's a little bit different, right? I mean, that's some Appalachian stuff going on there, right? No, it's a joke. If you're from there, I'm sorry. I shouldn't say that. I'll edit that out of the YouTube video. That happens a lot, actually. But you're right. I mean, it is weird. It's a different time, and the world's population is different. But I mean, it's weird. I mean, but we say that type of stuff isn't outlawed to the law of Moses at Mount Sinai about 500 years later. So we'll cut Abraham a little slack, And so, but yeah, it is a little different. She was a half sister, which made it half better than a full sister, I guess, right? True. Good. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
So is this how Abraham gained a lot of his wealth by going around and deceiving things like this?
You know, it's worked out pretty good so far, hasn't it?
He goes to different places and they say this every time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like you were saying, it seems to be a good con game they got going on. And this may have been the only 2 times in, I don't know, being 45 years no, not 45, 25 years since they left their father's house. Maybe the only 2 times where it didn't work. And so it may have worked dozens of times, and there are only 2 times it didn't work. But, like you were saying, he goes down to Egypt, he tricks Pharaoh, I think tricks is probably a good word. He tricks Pharaoh, and Pharaoh feels guilty and bad. He's taking somebody's wife. He gives him all kinds of stuff. We're talking about the most wealthy and powerful man in the world at this time. He gives Abraham all kinds of stuff. And then he goes to the king of the Philistines, who's nowhere near as powerful as a king of like Pharaoh. But still, he gives him livestock, and he gives him, more than a person can make in a lifetime, and then tells him, because Abraham's a nomad, right? He's got to travel to find, he says, look, as long as you're in my territory, you go anywhere you want to. You find the best field, the best flocks, the best wells, and you go there, and if somebody has a problem with it, you tell them, come talk to me. As a nomad, as somebody who's, has to go around to find good water and good fields, that's probably better than the money, to be honest with you. And so, yeah, it's worked out pretty well for Abraham.
Isn't it a little strange that they would give him those kind of wealth for a mistake that he made?
Yeah.
How did they do that?
I think because in both times you have God intervenes. Both times God tells Pharaoh and then Abimelech that you've messed up. And so they're not really afraid of Abraham. They're afraid that they've been visited by a deity. Whether they were monotheist or polytheist, they get the message that they've messed with the wrong guy. And that's why. In fact, in the next chapter, you're going to see that Abimelech is going to come out and make a peace treaty with Abraham. And he's going to tell him straight up. He's like, I don't trust you, but God's with you, so I want to make a peace treaty with you. And so even Abimelech isn't really fully trusting of Abraham because he just lied to him a couple of months earlier. But he says, it's obviously that God is with you because he spoke to me on your behalf. And so I want to make a peace treaty with you. Good comment. Anybody else? No? Abimelech means my king. Malach means king, and Abi means my, so my king. So, anybody else? Good questions and comments so far. And so let's talk about where this was taking place. You can see here on your map, that is the Sea of Galilee right there. No, that's the Dead Sea right there. And so you can see over here like Hebron, and you can see where Beersheba is. Now Beersheba is going to be important because Beersheba is going to be where Abraham is going to go next. And so here you see he's in Hebron, which is, if you see Judea in green on your screen, the city below that is Hebron. This is where that Abraham has been for a couple of years now, hanging out in this area. He decides to move south. He's in this area right here in red, Gerar, and this is where he's going to meet Abimelech. And then he's going to go, he's going to kind of settle a little bit south of here. He's going to kind of hang out in this area. And so now let's go ahead and let's go to Isaac and Ishmael in chapter 21. And so let's read verses 21 through verses 1 through 7. I'm sorry. Real quick question here. Before we read that, I'm sorry. I should have said in the last slide. Did Abraham show a lot of faith in his dealings with Abimelech? We got a yes and a no, all right? Brother Charles, why do you say yes?
Well, he gave him all that stuff. I hope he thought he would do it.
No, Abimelech gave him that stuff. Did Abraham act in faith? No. Okay. So, Caleb said no? So, do you accept Charles' answer of no? Okay. Now, why do you say no?
If he trusted in God, he wouldn't have to go down the line. He would know that it was in God's hands.
Yeah.
He had control.
Yeah. If God's already promised, look, man, you're going to have a son. He's going to be a great nation. He ain't got a son yet. Sarah's evidently not pregnant yet. So, you can't die, man. I mean, you've got to stick around for at least that part of the plan. And so, but yeah, Abraham shows us, just like he did earlier, that he doesn't have much of a faith to stand up to Abimelech. And so, not good on Abraham's part. And when the slide went to chapter 22, or 21, it messed with the screen, so you can't see that. It says Isaac is born. And if you can notice how that's spelled, just want to make sure everybody caught that. So, it's witty. And so, let's go ahead and let's read verses.
It's funny that God calls out on the kings and doesn't call Abraham out on it.
What's that?
It's funny that God calls whichever king out on it, but doesn't call Abraham out on it.
Yeah, it's true. It's funny how he doesn't reprimand Abraham. At least we're not told he does. It doesn't seem like he does. And so...
So you think he might give us some slack also?
I sure hope so. Yeah, and I think that we're going to see something really important in the next chapter, in this chapter and the next chapter. And spoiler alert, right? We're going to go through the rest of this chapter, and Abraham's had a weak faith. I mean, if you look at Abraham from chapter 12 when he's introduced, throughout his dealings in Egypt and in Canaan with different kings, different people, his faith's been very weak. There's been some good moments. I mean, he fights against the four kings, right, who fight against Lot and Sodom, stuff like that. But overall, he gets like a C- in the faith aspect, right? Doesn't really match up to the whole father of the faithful. But then when Isaac's born in chapter 22, in chapter 21, all of a sudden you see a change in Abraham. Almost overnight after Isaac is born. It's now that God has kept his promise and he has an heir that you really see him start to be that father of the faithful. Because he doesn't have enough faith to stand up to Pharaoh. He doesn't have enough faith to stand up to Abimelech. But in Genesis 22, what does God tell Abraham to do? Offer his only begotten son, his monogenes, as a sacrifice. Right?
That's a good thing we need to consider also that it took so long for that son to climb and get here. Him and Sarah both have done waited all these many years and become of old age. So that kind of tempts your faith there also.
Oh, yeah. I agree. And so when times are hard, sometimes it's harder to be faithful. And so maybe that did play a part into Abraham's slow-growing faith. But, not to give Abraham too hard of a time, he does leave his father's house. He does go to a land he's never seen before. He does take leaps of faith, but he does make blunders along the way where we think to ourselves, why did he do that? Now, why would he do such a thing? But when you get to Genesis 22 and he offers up Isaac, it really seems like this whole, because even in Hebrews, right? I know this is reading ahead, but in Hebrews chapter 11, what does the writer of Hebrews say that made Abraham willing to sacrifice his son? That's right. He knew that God would raise him from the dead. And so when Abraham went to Mount Moriah, which is where the temple would be built, 900 years later, almost 1,000 years later, the same mountaintop that Abraham goes up and offers Isaac is the same mountain that the temple is going to be built on 1,000 years later. It's really neat fact. And so as he goes up on that mountaintop and offers up Isaac, he's going to kill him. It's not just for show, because he knows he has so much faith. Now think about this. He didn't have enough faith not to sleep with Hagar. He didn't have enough faith not to beg God to accept Ishmael. He didn't have enough faith to really send Ishmael away in this chapter that we're going to see. He eventually does it because God tells him to. He doesn't have enough faith to do any of those things. And then in Genesis 22, he has so much faith in God and his promises that when God says this son is going to be who the covenantal blessing is going to pass through, Abraham has so much faith in God, he's going to kill his own son. Because he said, if God said that he's going to be a nation, then he can't die. Or if he dies, he can't stay dead. And so we're going to see that faith just explode exponentially. James?
Like Abraham and so many other instances, people weren't faithful and didn't have the faith to do that. And Christians that I'm trying to say, today a lot of half-Christians, the half-Christians today because they see all this stuff back there and God still supports them. and it's okay. I mean, as a Christian creed, that's what causes sin, weakness.
Yeah.
And God wants to go before it. Have Christians today.
It's a good question, and I think it gets back to the attitude. Now, don't misinterpret what I'm saying here. There's a difference in the idea that says, thank God I'm not the man I was yesterday. How's that saying go? It's the guy that wrote Amazing Grace. It's like thank God I'm not the man I was yesterday. By the grace of God, I'm not the man I ought to be. I don't know, but anyways, the idea is I'm not perfect, but I'm trying the best I can, right? That 1 John mentality, I write this letter to you so that you may not sin, but if you do sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. Like, that's a different attitude. That 1 John 1 through 7 is different than the Romans 6:1. Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Heaven forbid. Like, there's two different attitudes. And so I am thankful that we serve a God that doesn't strike us with a lightning bolt the first time we sin when we leave the baptismal waters, because I wouldn't have made it very long.
I'm going to have 17:30 about how they're able to weekend, but now I'll answer again.
That's right.
Change in his industry or something.
Yeah. Yeah, oh, absolutely. There's definitely got to be a change. But at the same time, it's hard for me to hold somebody to the same standard a week out of baptism. Now, I'm not saying we give people license to sin. That's by no means what I'm saying. But I expect more out of somebody that's been a Christian for 10 years versus somebody who's been a Christian for 10 days. You know what I'm saying? And so I think we kind of, there's a maturing process, right? And so I think you ought to be a better Christian at 30 years into Christ than you were at 3 years into Christ. Like, we should always be growing, and we should never be complacent. And I think that's what we see with Abraham. I think this shows us that God is faithful, right? Sometimes we talk about our faithfulness to God, which is half the equation, but on the other side of that equation is that God is faithful. And that's exactly when we get to the end of this chapter, he's going to name this Beersheba, and he's going to call on God as El Olam, which means some translations translate that as the everlasting God, or like the enduring God, but it could be like the faithful God. The idea of that God is faithful, and that He gives us time, He gives us the opportunity to grow and to mature. Now, if we don't grow and mature, and if we take His grace for granted, then the blood of Christ isn't going to cleanse us anymore. The Bible's clear about that in Romans 6 and 1 John 1. But
I don't care how much older Christian you are, you're still going to sin. That's where, you may not, that's the reason God says, I'm here, for you at all times.
That's right.
I think you still going to sin.
We'll never be perfect, but we shouldn't. I've seen it go the opposite way.
You're trying.
Yeah. Well, it's like I've had people tell me, well, David was a man after God's own heart, and David committed adultery. It's like, that's true, but God calls David a man after his own heart before he commits adultery, when he chooses him. So he doesn't say that after David commits adultery. So there's a difference there. And so also the idea of that in the book of Hebrews, it says these guys got a little bit more leeway because, number one, they didn't have the Word, and number two, they didn't have Jesus. Now, we're told in the book of Hebrews, we got both, right? We got the Word and we got Jesus, and we're held to a higher standard. And so God expects more of you, every single Christian, than He did of Abraham, even though he's the father of the faithful, even though God spoke directly with him. He lived for 100 years, only got spoken to 8 times. You have the whole counsel of God, and your hands are available to you at Dollar General for like $1.79. So God tells us in the book of Hebrews that every Christian is held to an even higher standard than Abraham was, or Isaac was, or David was, because we have Christ, we have a better covenant. And so, but it's true. But I do think these men are examples to show us that nobody's perfect, and we're all going to have high points and low points in our faith. The question is, do you keep trying to grow and keep trying to cultivate that relationship? Good questions. Good questions on that. Right? But let's go ahead and let's read verses 1 through 7 of Genesis chapter 21. The Lord visited Sarah as he said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who bore to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac on the 8th day, and God had commanded him. And Abraham was 100 years old when he had his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And so this is the climax of the covenant that God had promised Abraham. God not only allows Sarah to bear a son while being a woman who is barren, but also bearing a son after the age of menopause and after her organs have already stopped. She's already been through menopause. Genesis 18:11 tells us. And so not only was she barren, but she was past the age of bearing children. So Jesus kind of does a double miracle here. God does a double miracle here. Really, it goes back to verse 14 of chapter 18 when Sarah laughed and God said, is there anything too hard for the Lord to do? And so here he keeps his promise in Genesis chapter 11. And I saw Miss Julia's face when I said that Isaac was the only begotten son. I know why Miss Julia did that, because Miss Julia, did Abraham have more than one son? Yeah, he did, right? He had Ishmael, we're going to talk about here in a minute, but he also had 6 sons with Keturah, right? Sarah's going to die here in a few chapters. He's going to remarry Keturah. He's going to have 6 sons. The reason why I called Isaac the only begotten son, because in Genesis 3:16, it says, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son. The Greek word there is monogenes, right? In the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17, Isaac is referred to. Abraham went to go sacrifice his monogenes, his only begotten son.
Same as Christ, right?
Right. And so really, monogenes, only begotten, really means unique or special. And so a better translation of John 3:16 is his unique son. His one and only son, his special son. And so Isaac was not the only son begotten to Abraham, but he was the special, unique son. He was the son of promise, right? And so Jesus is God's son of promise. And so he's called laughter because both Sarah and Abraham laughed when they were told that they were going to bear a son. In Genesis 17:17, Abraham laughs. And Genesis 18:12 through 15, Sarah laughs. And then Ishmael, the older son, by 13 years, is expelled from the camp. So let's read verses 8 through 14. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, be not dismayed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and he sent her away, and she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And so the word here for laughing is similar to the word yitzchak, which means laughter. But the way that it is used oftentimes in the Old Testament is done in a manner of distaste, mocking. Mocking is kind of poor, tasteful jokes, I guess you would say, as a form of humor, although it's an inappropriate form of humor. Evidently, during the celebration of this, child mortality rates were very high in the ancient world. So if a child was able to be weaned from his mom about 3-4 years old, you were thought to be in the clear, like this kid's going to make it. And so there was a big celebration that, this kid's going to live. Think about how sad of a society that is. You got to wait till your kid's like 3 years old before you can celebrate the fact that, okay, this one's going to be sticking around. I mean, how blessed are we today to, it's just amazing how good we have it. But in Galatians chapter 4, Paul uses a different word to describe what Ishmael did to Isaac. Anybody know what that word is? Persecute, right? The son of the slave woman persecuted the son of promise, is what he says in Galatians chapter 4, verse 29. And so Isaac is about 3 years old. Ishmael is about 18 years old. Something happens. We're not exactly sure what, but Sarah says he's got to go. How does Abraham respond to this? Doesn't want it. I mean, Abraham is very attached to Ishmael. I mean, in the previous chapter, maybe 2 chapters ago, 2 chapters ago, in 18, 3 chapters ago, I guess, he begs God for him to accept Ishmael. God says, not going to happen. Now, Sarah says, take that slave woman and that, son and get them out of here. Doesn't even name their names. And so God says, do it. So he sends them out. We're not going to read that next section there. But as they go out towards Egypt, where Hagar is from, they only have enough water for a couple of days. They get to Beersheba and... they don't get to Beersheba. They get towards the Negeb. They have no water, and they're fixing to die, basically. And God intervenes, tells Hagar that he's going to be with her. He's going to bless Ishmael. He's going to become a great nation. And so he gives them water. He uncovers a well for them there. They take it. They go down to Egypt, and they find a wife for Ishmael. Now, Ishmael is already half what? What is he ethnically? He's half Hebrew by Abraham, but he's also half what? Egyptian. So he marries an Egyptian wife, and so the Ishmaelites are very close to Egyptians, both ethnically, but they also live in northwestern Sinai, which is right beside Egypt. They have a close relationship with Egypt. In fact, when Joseph's brothers sell him to a bunch of traders who are going to sell him in Egypt, who are they? The Ishmaelites, right? So strong trade ties with them. And then we're going to see the treaty and the covenant. And so we're not going to be able to read that, and I apologize for time's sake. It's verses 22 through 34. But Abimelech goes to Abraham and says, look, I can tell God is with you. He blesses you in whatever you do. I want to be your friend. Let's make a treaty. And so they make a treaty with each other. But there's a problem. Some time goes by, a few months, and Abraham has dug a well, and some people have come and they're using his well, which is a big no-no in the ancient world. If you didn't pay for it, you don't get to use it. It's a big deal. And so he goes to Abimelech and says, some of your servants have been drinking from my well. I don't appreciate that. And Abimelech's like, man, I don't know. Nobody's told me. And Abraham says, I tell you what, I'm going to give you 7 lambs. I'm going to give you some stuff so you'll believe me as an act of good faith. And Abimelech says, all right, I'll make a covenant with you. I'll accept your gifts and I will believe what you're saying. And so there they named the place Beersheba, which means the place of 7 wells. Or Shiva, meaning 7, also means oath in Hebrew. And so it could be the wells of oath or the wells of 7. We don't know what it is, but it's a very important place in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, let's see here. Isaac will build wells there. Jacob has a stairway vision after he leaves Beersheba. The sons of Samuel were prophets here. Saul, the first king, built a fortress here. Elijah fled from Jezebel here to Beersheba. From Dan to Beersheba was a common phrase because Dan was the northernmost boundary of the empire and Beersheba was the very most southern part. So it's a very important location in ancient Israel. It's also a very important location in modern day Israel. It is in the Negev. It is called the capital of the Negev. The Negev is the desert in between kind of Egypt and Jerusalem. And it is Israel's version of Silicon Valley. And so it is called the high-tech oasis of the desert. They have more world-class chess champions than any other place in the world. You may say, why is that important? It's not, but if you like chess, it's an interesting fact. This are the ruins of Beersheba, which you can visit today. About 2 miles from Beersheba, the ancient city, you have the modern city, what I told you. Its population of about 300,000. And so it's a very popular tourist destination for people today. If you look at the comparisons between chapters 12 and 15 and Genesis 20 through 22, it's interesting. Oftentimes people don't see this. And we did this a few chapters ago, right? We did this with Genesis chapter 1 through 3 and also 6 through 9 and talking about the correspondence between creation and also what takes place during the flood and the renewal. But you also see this double that takes place with Abraham when he goes down into Egypt and also when he does with Abimelech. And so if you'd like to see this, we're running out of time, but you can see how through inspiration these things line up so well. And so the threat from a foreign leader, divisions of the family, granting of the promised blessing, agreement with a foreign leader, heir crisis, descendants of the stars, recognition of Abraham's faith, and sacrificial context. And so it is really interesting to see through inspiration just how well the Bible has different literary features. And so for our takeaways, faith in God gives daily strength. The reason why Abraham was so scared whenever he went into those places is because his faith in God was not as it should be. Oftentimes, if we feel that we're living a life that is unfulfilled, if we feel like we are fearful in our daily Christian walks, oftentimes it's because our faith in God is not as good as it should be. Either our faith in the blessings He has given us, or how faithful we are at listening to His Word and His commands. The stronger our faith is in God, the stronger we're going to feel in our daily walks, right? If we are confident in our faith with God, then we can say, what shall man do to me? To whom shall I fear, right? We have this idea of you can't do anything to me because I know where my eternal soul is going to be. And so God knows, and so why be afraid? Number 2, God has the power to protect us from death. Here, He protects Hagar and Ishmael, and so He had the power to protect the people in the Old Testament from physical death. More importantly, He has the power to protect us from what type of death? Yeah, right? Spiritual death, eternal death. And so something a lot more cooler than uncovering a well in the desert, right? I mean, He's able to give us, the water that causes men to thirst no more, John chapter 4. And so, very important. And then also the monogenes, which is the Greek for the unique son, the only begotten, the one generation, if you will. And so Isaac is a type of monogenes. He's the son of promise that's going to bring covenantal blessing to Abraham. Jesus is our monogenes. He's the covenantal son that brings blessing to us. And so, does anybody have any questions or comments on Genesis chapter 20 or 21? But thank you for tonight. Sorry for rushing there towards the end. And so great comments and questions along the way. And I really appreciate you guys coming out in the cold weather. And some good news. I talked to Joe and his grandson, Cameron. It's Cameron Kierman. Is that right? That we prayed for Sunday night. Went and got a good report Monday from the cardiologist. And so they said that his heart looked good and that the thing that they were scared about wasn't there. And so prayers for Thanksgiving that Cameron is going to be okay. And so, anybody else have any prayer requests before we pray? If not, let's go ahead and let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for all the many blessings You've given us. We're so thankful for the recent news of Cameron and that everything is well with him and his heart. And we're so thankful for the power of prayer and that You answer our prayers. Dear Heavenly Father, we're also thankful for men like Abraham who remind us that You call us to be faithful, not perfect, and that we can be able to see the growth that took place in the life of Abraham. And dear Heavenly Father, we pray for each soul that is here tonight and for each member of this congregation that we will live our lives in a way that is faithful to You, and that through the days and years of our service to You, that our faith in You will continue to grow each and every day. Dear my Father, we realize that just like Abraham, there will be times of difficulty. There will be times where our faith is tested. There will be times where we are tempted by Satan or by our own desires. And help us, dear Heavenly Father, to have the faith and to have the strength to be able to serve You and to say no to those things, and to be able to show our love and devotion to You by following You and obeying You. And dear Heavenly Father, please be with us and watch over us and help us to be like Abraham, who was an alien in a foreign land. Help us to realize that we are not of this world, but help us to find those in this world who need to come to a knowledge of You and Your salvation through Your Son. And it's in His name we pray. Amen.